Hi, I'm Daryl McIntyre. Thank you for joining us. We are talking about health for small ruminant animals. This is the final episode in our Raised with Care Stewardship Sessions. It has been quite a great run on behalf of the ABVMA, and I'm glad you've been able to join us for this final episode. Our conversation, as all of them have been, is being live streamed. So we'll be discussing ruminant animal health issues. We will talk about how to identify some of those issues. We're also talking about prevention strategies today, how a relationship with a veterinary team can have a positive impact on the health of your animals and even also on your bottom line to make sure that you're protecting that pocketbook as well as your animal's health. For those of you who are joining us in real time today, and we have a number of you joining us already, it would be great if you have comments or questions or some feedback to go ahead and leave a comment through YouTube Live or Facebook Live. That interactivity is really important. We'll go through the majority of our presentation, and then if we get some comments and questions from you, we'll make sure that our guest has an opportunity to address them. And again, we may not have a lot of people watching in one moment, but all of these sessions have been then essentially PVR'd and watched in archive form afterwards a number of times. So those of you who are live, you can help make it better for everybody when they view it after the fact. If you do want to see any of our previous episodes, we've talked about the beef industry, dairy industry, pork, poultry, beekeeping, companion animals. We've pretty much been across the board on this. All of those are available on the raisedwithcare.ca website. All you have to do is just go there and follow the links. Today, we are talking small ruminant animals, and as always, we have a few fascinating facts to lead you into this. According to Alberta lamb producers, there are about 1 million sheep in Canada on about 11,000 farms, and Alberta has 2,000 sheep farms, approximately. The main market for sheep in Canada is actually for lamb meat. We produce about 40% of the lamb that we consume, and then the rest is imported from New Zealand and Australia for the most part. Alberta is one of the top 3 provinces in the nation for wool production. As far as goats are concerned, the Government of Canada reports Alberta has the 3rd largest amount of goat milk producers in Canada. And the Canadian National Goat Federation says that we consume more goat meat than we actually produce. And this is an interesting, unusual little fact that some of you may know, some of you may not. Did you realize that coffee, reportedly, was first discovered when goat herders noticed their goats were being rather energetic after nibbling on some coffee plants? In terms of llamas and alpacas, camelids, the Canadian Llama and Alpaca Association says there are about 28,500 alpacas in Canada, an increase of nearly 50% over the past 14 years, and nearly 40% of the country's llama and alpaca population is right here in Alberta. So there are a few facts just to sort of set things up and get to understand your industry and the animals that you're raising as we get ready to welcome our guest, Dr. Lynn Tait. Welcome, Lynn. Nice to see you. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about small ruminant animals. You ready to go?
I sure am. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Why don't I just give our audience a little bit of background on you so that they have a bit of an understanding of to where you're coming from as you're speaking during this session. Dr. Tait was born and raised in Alberta, graduated from the University of Saskatchewan in 1990 with degrees in both agriculture and veterinary medicine. Currently owner of OC Flock Management, which since 1996 has provided small ruminant veterinary and consulting services, plus operating CFIA approved and CETA certified semen and embryo production facilities. And in fact, right now, OC Flock is one of only 4 facilities in the world that is accredited to export semen and embryos to the EU. So clearly there is a great relationship there. Over the past 25 years, Lynn has maintained a sheep flock of her own, so she gets to practice what she preaches and teaches, and has been actively involved in the sheep and goat industries domestically and internationally. Also teaches small ruminant medicine as a contract instructor at the University of Calgary in the College of Veterinary Medicine, and also her and her company help to support the industry by sponsoring a number of 4-H clubs and 4-H on parade in Calgary. So, boy, you've got a little bit on the resume, and I was going to say we saved the best for last, but the other truth to this is that you just weren't around. You were actually overseas last month, were you not?
Yes, when the ABVMA actually asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, the date was in October or early October, I think. And because of the embryology work and the repro work I do, I was actually work for a company called AB Europe in the UK. I'm usually gone all of September to work for them. And so I was there, and you graciously moved the small ruminant date to November so I could get home, get my 14 days isolation done before I did this. So it's kind of nice.
So you could say it was that, or we just saved the best for last, depending on your point of view.
Well, the sheep and goats are the best.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll
And
save
llamas
them
and
for last.
alpacas too. Never forget the camelids as well.
Yep.
Why don't we get at it here? Talk to me a little bit. What are the major health issues that are facing? Well, in goats and sheep, there's going to be differences. So let's start with sheep, shall we? Since you have a flock, the major health issues that most people are producing sheep might end up having to face.
I think in general, we kind of have two classes of diseases that we look at. One is the sheep and goat world, and they are more similar than you think, have what we call production limiting diseases. So those are diseases that don't kill off animals necessarily, but they reduce performance within a flock. And most of those in sheep and goats are, we don't necessarily have vaccines for them. And so they're hard to prevent. And once they have them, they're not treatable or curable. So there's sort of that group. And then we have the typical type of diseases where we see things like parasites and pneumonia in lambs, some of the more common, typical type of diseases you'd see in any livestock operation. And so we kind of have to look at them in those two groups.
Just run through some of those production reducing types of diseases, and even if they can't be completely cured, can you at least manage them to try and ease up on that reduction in production?
Yeah, so some examples of those that are most common in the sheep and goat world are caseous lymphadenitis, which is a bacterial infection of the lymph nodes. Johne's disease, which is different clinical signs sometimes, but it's the same disease that we see in cattle that affects the gut and causes poor thrift. And then we also see a disease, Medivisna in sheep. It's called caprine arthritis encephalitis in goats. It's a virus that's in the same family of viruses as actually HIV in people. So it's a chronic low-grade infection. So those are the type of things we deal with. And a lot of the approach to them is either to, in some flocks, to eradicate and then maintain biosecurity practices so you don't bring the disease back in. As some of the larger operations may have low levels, and they can cope with the lower levels because there's a cost association to an eradication program. But ultimately minimizing the impact of those diseases, which is usually minimizing the level in the flock, since we don't have a cure. So
well, especially
if somebody affected animals.
If somebody's a relatively small operator, doesn't have a lot, eradication becomes a very emotional and intense sort of situation, I would think.
It can. So the very small producer, where their animals are almost more like a pet, you're right. They have names, they have attachment to them. That's a issue we have to deal with. And then the very large operations, it becomes the economic reality of the cost of testing and culling productive animals. So I always try to convince people, if you're going to get bigger, think about these things while you're small, because they get more expensive as you get bigger if you choose to deal with them later on. But certainly there is the small flocks and we see quite a lot of those. I think the average sheep flock is still only about 35 or 40 head. And so, for those people, there's an emotional attachment that they may be prepared to live with, because production is not what it's all about for them. If you have 20 sheep, you're probably not paying your mortgage off your sheep. You're keeping them for a different reason.
Probably not. No, indeed. So sheep and goat, those diseases pretty much in both species, or is there something? Are there other health issues that might be more specific to goats that we haven't covered yet?
No, there's quite a lot of a crossover between sheep and goats. And while the diseases like with the CAE and MV are caused by slightly different virus, they have the same implications and are managed in the same manner. So the two species are actually in that way quite similar in the problems. The approaches might vary a little bit by species.
All right, I'll get into a little bit more in treatment in a moment, but as we're looking at some of the health issues that are facing, when you're talking about camelids, alpacas, or llamas, what kind of health issues are they facing, and what can be done about them? Because it's a different set of issues between camelids and sheep and goats.
Yeah, so most of the camelids that we would deal with, especially as veterinarians, are in more of a pet-like situation. When they were first coming into Canada in the 90s, shortly after I graduated, they were very popular. People had larger herds of them. That's fairly unusual now. So now we don't see herd type diseases because they just don't have big herds of them. And actually, with the exception of you may get some dental issues, foot issues, those type of things, llamas and alpacas are actually a pretty generally healthy group of animals. The ones I mainly see often are guardian animals within a sheep or goat operation, helping with predator control. So they are susceptible to caseous lymphadenitis, but the other sheep and goat diseases don't transfer to camelids.
Okay,
So, I mean, from a sort of pet standpoint, they're pretty solid health-wise.
good to know. Maybe that's my next pet. We'll see. Have to get some sheep for them to take care of, though, at the same time, perhaps. So let's get back to sheep and goats and treating of some of these diseases. As you mentioned, some of them can't be cured. And vaccines are very low. Just explain why there are so few vaccines available for diseases affecting sheep and goats.
Well, I guess there's two things. One is there are some diseases like Yonis. They have developed a vaccine in Australia, but the overall long-term effectiveness as part of a management or eradication program, it's still pretty open to debate. So for some of the diseases, for Medibesin and CAE, they have not developed a vaccine. I'm not sure if that's the type of virus it is. There isn't a vaccine for HIV either. So it may well be the group of viruses just don't lend themselves well to vaccination. The other is that our industry in Canada is relatively small. So if you go to somewhere like Australia or the UK where they have a larger sheep industry, they actually have vaccines for things like pneumonia, like we have in cattle. So it's not that they always don't exist, but in Canada, a lot of times the industry is not large enough for the company to spend the money to go through the licensing process strictly for Canada. And so some of our hurdles in not just vaccines, but a lot of the drugs, they don't have label claims, researched withdrawal times, that type of thing for specific licensing in North America, not just in Canada. And that's in part because it's economics. If they have to spend $1 million to sell $10,000 worth, the company's not going to spend the money. And that is certainly recognized as an issue in food safety. A lot of what we do is based on research or information from other countries, which I believe a sheep is a sheep, regardless of where you put it. But that is one of the challenges, is that sometimes they're available and they're just not licensed here. And others are just diseases that don't lend themselves well and don't have a treatment per se, especially viral diseases.
And we're seeing some questions come in already. I do want to sort of get through our framework here first, and then we'll come back and then we'll be all over the place, but we'll hit up a whole bunch of those questions. You can keep them coming in, and thank you for that, but we will get to those in just a few moments. You also talked about a bacterial infection. A lot of our stewardship sessions initially were going to talk about antimicrobial stewardship as well. In this case, it doesn't. How often are antibiotics used to treat sheep and goats, for example, and what kind of issues are we dealing with antibiotics right now in this area?
I think, generally speaking, we would treat the same types of things with antibiotics as a lot of other species. Individual infections, respiratory infections, wounds, injuries, those types of things. The sheep and goat industry, in part because of the smaller flocks, we don't see as much preventative antibiotic treatment like they would with incoming treatment protocols, say in a large cattle feedlot. We tend not to see as much of that, but I think part of that is our flock size is smaller, and so we don't see as many of those diseases. One of the challenges, again, is not very many of the antimicrobials have a thing on the side of the bottle that says if you are a sheep, you should get 3 mils, and it has a meat withdrawal of 12 days. So again, a lot of times that's at the discretion of veterinarians to have the research and the knowledge to use the drugs appropriately in a species that's what they call off-label. And so we have that sort of discretionary power. And I think the vast majority of producers really don't want to overuse antimicrobials, that they want to use them when they need them. But they want good information, and hopefully veterinarians can help provide that because it's not on the side of the bottle.
And we are going to talk more about prevention strategies and management and that kind of thing to try and keep these things from even getting into your flock in the first place. But before we get to that, there is still an issue with parasites. And can you just talk a little bit about the parasite issue and some of the problems with some of the deworming that is available and maybe too available right now? So parasites first.
So parasites can be a problem to all ruminant grazing type species, but sheep and goats are particularly susceptible to parasitic infections. I'm not sure why that is necessarily, but over time and with a lot of use of chemical deworming or chemical treatment to get rid of parasites without some other management strategies employed, worldwide, sheep and goats are seeing quite a significant development of resistance. So the parasites are becoming resistant to the drugs. When I graduated in 1990, ivermectin was hot off the press, brand new. I think it was actually licensed in 1988, and it was the answer and the be all and the end all. And now we have significant resistance to it. So, all things over time. And that was the last sort of big new dewormer to come out until one that's specific for resistant homuncus came out a couple of years ago. So it's not like we're getting new options on the market on a regular basis, and whether they just aren't being developed or just don't exist. So I think we have to seriously look at chemicals is not the only way to work with parasites in small ruminants in particular.
And then if you do want to use them, try and be more targeted as opposed to just, we have to worm them every couple months just to make sure. You need to be a lot more targeted. Is that fair?
Right. There's important things like accurate dosing. People always think their sheep are bigger than they are when they go to sell them, and smaller than they are when they go to deworm them. And so accurate dosing, appropriate timing, using some other strategies, or targeting individual animals as opposed to whole flock treatment are some of the things that can be used to minimize resistance while getting the maximum amount of effectiveness from the drugs that we have, and to minimize parasites within a herd. You're never going to be parasite free. That should never be the end goal because it's unachievable.
So give me an idea what kind of things most of your clients would be coming to you with questions, for health questions. What are they trying to get answers? Because a lot of people who have sheep, larger producers, but even the smaller ones, are pretty knowledgeable about what they have, etc. So what are they looking for from you when they're trying to get some new information on the health issues that their flock might be facing?
Well, I guess producers that I have come to me, and that ultimately some of them end up to be my longtime clients, kind of fall in two camps. I actually find that new people coming into the industry, especially now, we're seeing more people coming into the industry who don't even necessarily come from a farming background of any sort, and so they tend to be quite proactive about wanting to have solid advice and a plan moving forward, and maybe assistance on where and how to purchase stock, or what kind of questions do you ask when you go to buy animals. So I get those group of producers, which are kind of fun to work with because they haven't actually experienced any huge problems, but they're being very proactive. It's very much, they go into it with much more of a businessy attitude, I guess, because they didn't grow up with it. They just go, we know nothing. They have no preconceived ideas. The other group of producers I often see often end up kind of coming around to me, sometimes by referral from their regular local practice, because they've entered a disaster, or they're in the middle of something or they have questions that their local vet can't answer. So the two big ones for me are, as I see the people that are in a crisis and their local, I have one client, I've had them now for quite a few years. They came to me because their local vet said, I don't know what's happening. You're having a crisis in the middle of lambing a large group, and you need to find somebody who knows more about sheep medicine than we do.
Now, when you say crisis in lambing, does that mean a lot of them? Does that mean a lot of them were dying or losing?
Yeah, well, no, so they had ewes that weren't going into labor properly. I think when the clinic finally said this to them, their local clinic, they had a number of cesareans, which in the sheep and goat world is fairly rare to have a group of cesareans. They had lambs that were dying and ewes that didn't want their lambs, and they were not brand new. This was a new thing, not a new farm.
Okay.
And so it took us a few months. We actually kind of figured it out almost by accident with some other things that happened unrelated to lambing. But I get those group of people as well, which again, I quite enjoy, because the good part is if we can get it figured out, they feel like choosing to be sheep producers was not the bad decision. And then we kind of move forward from there. And often with clients like that, they're distant from me. And so I tend to work with them on the bigger picture. And then the individual sheep got chewed on by a coyote or something and needs individual care. A lot of times we have a pretty good working relationship with their local veterinarians as well.
People can see you as they're watching, we're just having some bandwidth issues, but we can still see you. We can still hear you. You're just in a slightly smaller picture, but you're still giving us a big picture. So this is all working out in the meantime. So just wanted to acknowledge that. And hopefully, I think the weather is not all that great in your area, so it might be messing with your towers nearby or something to that effect. Let's talk about prevention then. How do we prevent?
Maybe it's very windy.
Oh, then yeah, windy is often a problem. Give me some prevention strategies then, so that we never even have to get to the whole treatment options, because as we all know, prevention is a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier on your bottom line than having to treat the issues after the fact. So prevention strategies.
Yeah, so in the small ruminant world, if we consider that most of the diseases that could end up in your flock, you've either bought them already in some animals, or you've brought them in. Now, whether that's on trailers or clothing or visitors. So one of the key things I think in small ruminants, even more so than maybe say, cattle or horses or some of the other species, is biosecurity. You don't know what you're tracking onto your farm. As an example, you have to get in the mindset. You just have to think about it all the time. It's like, where have I been? What have I touched? Where do I wear these clothes? And so I have one client that in order to make sure when they take animals to sell at the auction, if they have lambs or goat kids that they're selling, she went out and bought the most hideous, uncomfortable pair of pink rubber boots you could ever imagine in your life. And those are her auction mart boots, because she said they're horrible, they're uncomfortable. So she said she puts them on, she goes in, she unloads, she does what she needs to do. And she said, I would never get in the truck and drive home in those because they hurt my feet, and they're hideous. Like they're not like wearing your nice muck boots. And so her temptation to ever end up going home in those or wearing those at her own farm, she doesn't even have to think about it. So it's just little things like that. When visitors come to your farm, some of my clients make them put on boots and coveralls and everything that are on that farm. And you should see me trying to wear a size 10 shoes and a men's extra large coveralls. It's quite amusing. And some people will have the little booties, the plastic covers like they wear in hog barns. So, we don't raise them indoors. Our biosecurity level is probably not going to match that of a hog or a chicken barn, but it's certainly a big way to prevent bringing diseases onto your farm.
Well, and it is interesting. Actually, one of the questions that came in comes from Tara, wanting to know how effective are screening tests prior to herd starting to ensure that those diseases aren't brought in to a starter herd in the first place. Screening tests, is that vital? Is that a vital step to take?
I think it depends a little bit on the disease. So, for example, Johne's testing in cattle, the blood test and or the test on feces, is reasonably accurate. The blood test in small ruminants is very poor. So it will miss a lot of animals that may already be infected at a low level. They'll show up negative. The Medivisna testing, on the other hand, is fairly accurate. And it's never a one-shot deal. You can't just do one test and say, absolutely clean, never going to be a problem. But pre-screening and being diligent and asking the right questions about where you source your animals is definitely one of the factors that go into maintaining that status.
And where you're sourcing, you're relying then on the whoever's sourcing providing those sheep are also trying to protect their reputation. So you're relying on that reputation and that background and that history to ensure that you're getting healthy animals.
Yeah, Yeah, it's certainly, one of the parameters to consider. And I always tell people, here's sort of with my clients, here's a list of questions. If you're going to go buy sheep from somebody, ask these type of questions, because sometimes how easily they have the answers maybe tells you more than what the answers are themselves. The other thing too is I always tell people, go and visit, look around, see what you see, because I have quite a few people who would say, I don't have CL in my flock. And then I walk onto the farm and think, there's a lot of suspicious looking lumps on those animals, but they're just attributing them to some other kind of abscess. And so sometimes, like, you really have to, I don't think I'd ever buy sheep sight unseen unless, you could really sort of document the flock status of where they came from. And there are some, like in Ontario, they have an actual MediVisna accreditation program. And there are very strict standards to being on the program. So somebody was buying sheep from there that said, we don't have it MediVisna, you could believe that. But we don't have any real national programs like that at this point. I think, industry-wide amongst us vets, that would be nice to have that standard, but it's not there yet.
Well, facility management can also be of assistance if you're bringing in new animals, perhaps having them if you have the facility available too, you can sort of move them and quarantine them in a different area. That would be helpful. Also a question about how long that quarantine should be, and then how far apart the test would be as well. So how do you, can you mitigate some of those risks by bringing in an animal from somewhere else that you may not be sure of, if you have the facility and that quarantine area that you can do with you can deal with it, plus how long does it take?
You certainly can. And for general diseases that may show up, any respiratory type diseases, foot rot, things like that, I would say a minimum 30-day quarantine. Some people will do 60. Sometimes stress will trigger a disease flare up of something that's underlying, and, just moving to a new farm for a sheep sometimes can be a stress. So, there's certainly those options and some pre-screening, and that's where I think every farm is going to be different, and every source of new genetics is going to be different. And so that's where working with your veterinarian to say, okay, in our situation and where these animals are coming from, what do we need to do to mitigate risk? Because that's always what it's about. I have one client that really wanted new genetics, and they bought a ram from Quebec, and because of mitigating risk for their farm, that ram is actually in our semen facility now, and we're going to collect semen and we're going to use artificial insemination on their farm. That ram will probably never go to their farm because the semen is much safer than the ram. So it really depends what level of risk. If you look at the bottom level of biosecurity, that risk is probably minimized, would be something like a feedlot. By the nature of what it is, animals are moving in and out of there all the time. So, for a feedlot can't really be biosecure. And then the other extreme is clients that are on the certified level of the Scrapie flock program. They're closed, they've tested, they don't have a lot of these diseases. They're not going to bring any live animals in. They're going to find another way, like semen or embryos, to bring new genetics into their flock. And then there's everybody who falls somewhere in the middle of that. So it's working with your vet or a knowledgeable person to decide what's best for you.
Well, and that's also where I wanted to go next, because we've also talked about having an animal health protocol and having a plan that you set up with your vet. And now it could be someone who's working on small ruminants at your level, or it could be another vet who's doing other animal practice as well. But how important is that animal health protocol, or creating that plan, that health plan, to make sure that you actually have a roadmap to go down if you do run into any problems?
I think it's important for all species, but especially because of the type of diseases we deal with in small ruminants, that prevention is such a big key. And also management and nutrition kind of all go hand in hand. So I always view it as a team. Mm-hmm. Part of your team is maybe the nutritionist, part of your team is your veterinarian. And if we have all of those things, that if we've got preventative health and nutrition and facilities and management, if those things are ticking along, then the actual disease aspect goes way down, mm-hmm. Which certainly both economically and in the case of, the use of antimicrobials, that type of thing, that is good for everybody, because certainly for the producer, it's good for their bottom line if they're not having to spend a lot of money basically putting out fires. When I teach my students in third year, I always tell them, if you get the management and nutrition right, then most of your sort of day-to-day disease gets minimized, and then you can work on fine-tuning things.
And you've talked previously about how the industry can be in other parts of the world, and then it can be much larger in other areas, and so that they might be more advanced. Especially with how your work has been going, you would certainly be able to bring some of that expertise, if not all the vaccines or drugs that might be available over there. You could at least bring that expertise and then add it to a health protocol here, I would think.
Yeah, hopefully. I get to see some different things when I travel. The other thing is, I belong to it's called the American Association of Small Ruminant Practitioners. But it's a group of veterinarians basically worldwide that all work in the field of, they include cervids, they include deer and small ruminants as well, but sheep, goats, and camelids. And the nice part about that, and it's not expensive for even local vets to belong, is that you can draw on a wealth of international knowledge and probably combined hundreds of years of experience. They have an email list that a lot of veterinarians belong to, where you can throw a question out there and the people who do the research and write the textbooks may answer. And so I think, if the producer gets the benefit of that through the veterinarian, I think that's helpful too, because there's a lot of information out there, and don't get me wrong, some of it's really good and it's really accurate, and some of it is a little out there.
Well, you could say that about a lot of things in this world right now, and so that certainly applies across the board. When he's talking about a team, then because you specialize in this area, probably more so than a lot of other veterinarians, does the team then become sort of your local veterinarian, then perhaps using you as a resource as well, and then the actual producers themselves? So there's a much larger team, it seems like, that can be created here.
Yeah, it sure can. Sometimes local veterinarians who are interested in sheep and goats, especially a lot of the newer grads, in the last 6 or 7 years that I've been teaching at the university, there's a lot of interest in small ruminants, and they certainly get more small ruminant education than we did back when I took my vet school. But yeah, it can be your local vet, or like I say, I have clients that are close enough geographically that I do a lot of their flock work. Mm-hmm. And then I have clients that are quite distant. And so it becomes, I try to help set the bigger health protocols, the preventative programs, treatment protocols for lambs, because lambing time is usually where you get most of the things that you're going to have to deal with, that you have some sort of protocol to deal with problems. But then their local veterinarians are also on board. And a lot of times they're quite happy to say, if somebody kind of sets out the big picture, we're happy to do a little bit more of the day-to-day stuff. And I think people need to not be afraid to do that. Certainly, I like working with the local vets. And if somebody calls me with a question, or, we have this client and are we approaching this? Have we missed something? I'm always happy to kind of help their vets out.
And you know what? We'll touch on a couple of more points here, and then I want to get to some of the questions. And then for those of you who are watching during the live stream, we'd love to get any more questions to come in. I'll get to the ones that are up there. So Al, I'll get to yours in a moment here, and we'll continue on with that Q&A. But a couple of things with facility management, water and pasture rotation or management, both are important for different reasons, right?
Yeah. So water quality for all livestock is important. And certainly sheep and goats, believe it or not, don't drink as much as people think they do. So, that's one of the things that we consider with nutrition. We do see urinary calculi that can cause obstruction so that males can't urinate, which can be fatal. And water can often be a contributing component to that. So water testing is one of the things we do a lot in small ruminants to make sure that we're balancing rations. People have very, very hard water. It tastes great to drink, but it's got very high calcium levels typically. And this can be a problem if we don't balance it. The pasture and pasture management rotation mainly has to do with parasite management. It's part of a bigger picture in managing your parasite load. Is, how do you minimize the amount of parasites that they're consuming, and that they're not reinfecting themselves off the same pasture. And a lot of people, there's a lot more research now, and a lot of people are becoming more progressive about, you don't just chuck the ewes out on a quarter section and see them in September. And you can get more productivity out of your pasture with a little bit extra management too.
Okay, and a fascinating point that I had never even considered or thought about. A lot of people will have guard animals, guard dogs, guardian dogs, in order to take care of the flock. There can be a transference as well, right? Because we've looked at zoonotic diseases, things that can transfer from species to species. I don't know if that's that much of a problem with sheep and goats, but it can be with depending on the dogs as well. Just explain that.
Yeah, so guardian dogs are very commonly used as to protect against predators. And dogs, Liz, we pretty much all know, get tapeworms, or they can get tapeworms. And when the dog tapeworm is ingested by the sheep is not the normal host. And so what happens is that instead of the tapeworm being in the gut where it's supposed to be, it forms cysts in the muscle. So in sheep, this is called cysticercus. And it's still one of the number one reasons that lamb carcasses are condemned at slaughter, is because they have these cysts in them. And it's pretty easily preventable. We just have to get people on board to the fact that they need to routinely deworm both guardian dogs and herding dogs. If they have, border collies and stuff that are around the sheep a lot, they need to keep them routinely dewormed for tapeworms. And I know it's a bit of a struggle because it's expensive to deworm for tapeworms, especially in these 150 pound guardian dogs. Yeah. But it's important for the quality of the product that's going out the other end.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions now. Actually, we did have Grant to it very early on when we were talking about the different vaccines that are available, just mentioning of knowing that there's available one for sheep in the UK and that kind of thing. That has to be frustrating for some producers to know that there are options elsewhere that are not just available here. And I know you already touched on that, but that has to be a frustration as well, isn't it?
It can be, but certainly I think a shining light for those of us on the veterinary side was that there's a product called Medicam, which is an anti-inflammatory that's used as a pain medication.
I think I've used it on my
dogs. So it originally was licensed for cattle in North America. Yeah, exactly. So there's a large animal version. Basically, it's the same drug. It's just strong. It's a stronger strength, so you don't have to give 3 bottles of it to the cow or the sheep. It was originally licensed here for cattle and large animals. The governments of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all got together, and they worked with the company to do the research to actually get a sheep label for that product in all 3 countries, all simultaneously based on the same research. That was like a major leap forward from every country wanting their own research done in their own country. So, and that was sort of a milestone. So there's people like Dr. Paula Menzies, who's retired now, but she was with Ontario Veterinary College forever, who are working very, very hard to try to get more of the products that, if the UK has hundreds of thousands more sheep to trial a pneumonia vaccine than we do, can we assume that a sheep is a sheep regardless of what continent it's on? And can we work with that to get some of these things available here? So that, like you say, that was sort of a breakthrough for us that they finally did this. And so maybe more will come down in the future.
A sheep is a sheep, goat is a goat. Camelids are different entirely. But there is a question from Al who wanted to know whether or not you can use oral sheep dewormers on camelids.
You absolutely can. You probably need to check with a veterinarian or somebody who can give you the appropriate dosage rate, because they are given a different dosage rate than sheep or goats. Even sheep and goats can be different on their dosing rate. But yes, the same types of products that are used in sheep and goats can certainly be used in llamas and alpacas.
We have a question in from Lana, who has had an awful year for foot scald this year and says that the copper treatment has not been working. Are there any other suggestions for dealing with foot scald?
You have to have a really good talk with Environment Canada and make it stop raining in the summer. We did see a lot of scald this year, but it was because it was a very wet summer. And scald, unlike contagious foot rot, scald is generally the result of their feet, literally their feet being wet all the time.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, if you wash a lot of dishes and your skin gets tender because of it, they see scald in places like the UK. Like if you don't see a lame sheep every day in a flock, there's something, they must be in a drought. And so there's not a lot you can do other than to get them on higher, drier ground. And this year's been so wet, it's been really tough.
And there aren't really any other treatments apart from the copper treatment?
No, and lots of times it's just because the skin is so wet and tender between the toes that often getting them on dry ground and not even worrying so much about treating them, they'll improve just by drying their feet out.
And just another on pasture management, and I know we did touch on it, but maybe a bit more of a specific question from Christine wanting to know about suggestions, like actual concrete suggestions for pasture management in order to help with the parasite control. Because we did talk about that a little bit, but didn't really get into what you really should be doing to ensure that the parasite control is there.
That's about a book and a half. As a resource, what I would suggest, and it's not light reading, but it's very well done, is that the Ontario Sheep, I think they're Osm, Ontario Sheep Marketing Agency, there's something called the 5-Star Worm Program. It's a PDF document. You can, if you Google it, trust me, you'll find it. It's a bit of a read, but it is excellent about really laying it out at producer understanding level of how to manage parasites and what's refugia. Like we want to always have some susceptible parasites. It's never a goal to be parasite free because that won't happen. And we don't want to build resistance. And so I think that's a good starting point. If a producer is looking for those options, start by reading that to kind of get a firm understanding of the life cycles, because how you rotate depends on the life cycle length for the parasite. Sometimes you rotate it exactly the right amount to make the problem worse. But that's it. It's a really good resource to start with. Yeah, it's not light reading, but it's very valuable.
Well, sometimes it's worth investing that time a little bit and just diving into it and finding out more. But you're right; it could probably go on for 3 or 4 more sessions like this in order to talk about that. So, by the way, for those of you who are watching live stream, thank you for the comments and for the questions. If you have any more questions, better get them in now because we're going to wind down here fairly soon. So that's just your heads up and your fair warning that we're going to need your questions in pretty quick if you want any more answered. In the meantime, just talk a little bit about telemedicine in this current world that we're living through, how effective that has been and how much it has increased just even in the last little while.
Well, I guess from the perspective of somebody who graduated before home computers and smartphones, the technology, I think, has given us the opportunity. I mean, telemedicine when I graduated was literally you talked to the guy on the phone and you hoped you were both talking about the same thing. And so it was very much but I really need to see it.
Yeah.
And now we've evolved to the point where, I have clients who send me pictures of things. They'll say, we saw this, or what do you think about what this lamb's doing? And I get this little video. And I think that gives us the opportunity to be there for our clients, but be very cost effective. The extreme example for me in the COVID crazy world wasn't even because of COVID. I was overseas and I have a client who's in the middle of an eradication program and they got some unanticipated lab results. And so, at that point, they were kind of in a struggle of where do we go and what do we do now? And I was in the UK, but over a series of several late evenings for me because of the time change, we had 2 or 3 Zoom meetings. We got a chance to talk about it and look at the results and make a plan going forward. And, for some of those type of things, the vet doesn't necessarily have to be in the same room. And so I think technology has given us lots of opportunity. And certainly for me, consulting with other veterinarians has been great because they can send me pictures, they can send me video, and we can sit and we can talk about it. And we don't necessarily have to be in the same place. So I think it's a major bonus. Yeah. I think the livestock industry's done a lot of it for a long time, and now we can actually use it to everybody's benefit.
Your phone's going to start ringing like crazy here over the next little while after having said that. A couple other rapid fires, just so we have a few more questions in. How can a farmer find out about nutritional value of feed varieties, not a custom ration? Barley compared to what? To wheat, compared to hay, compared to different silages, etc. What kind of information, where can he access that kind of information on that nutritional value?
Okay, so for forages like hay and silage, those types of things, they can vary so much from year to year and season to season, even from field to field. They really do need a feed test to get those numbers. For things like, a lot of the grains are a lot more consistent. So I don't know if they have it outside of the program, but there is a program called Sheep Bites, which it's a web-based program which you can tinker around balancing rations, and it has the 10-year rolling average for a lot of different types of hays and grains and stuff within Alberta built into it, and it stays updated. If a person wants to subscribe to it, I think I have the multi-user version because I have different clients on it. Okay. The single user version, I think, is $50 a year, and you can go through Alberta Lamb Producers website to find it. But that's where you could find those kind of rolling averages for the province.
Perfect. Question from Aaron about polio in sheep. Symptoms, treatments, what are they? A vitamin B thiamine with question marks after it, saying, are those reasonable treatments?
So polioencephalomalacia, generally in sheep and goats, is a thiamine deficiency. But a normal, healthy ruminant of any sort produces the bacteria in their rumen, produces the thiamine that they require. So if you get a polio symptom where they call it stargazing, they kind of sit on their chest and tip their heads back and look at the sky. And then it can progress to something that almost looks like seizures. They can't stand up and they paddle. That thiamine deficiency is caused by something that has affected the ability of the rumen bacteria to produce its own thiamine. So there's generally an underlying cause. The most common one is if they get a sudden feed change, and it changes the pH of the rumen, and it can affect the bacterial population. So thiamine is the treatment of choice, and it's not hard to give it, but you have to look at what was the underlying reason that it happened in the first place.
Okay. Thank you. Perfect answer. By the way, Jana just put the Sheep Bites link up on the chat on Facebook. So thank you for that, Jana. How often should we have fecal egg counts done? And if deworming is needed, when should a follow-up count be done?
Okay, so I can only I'll speak to Alberta, because when you do it and how often really depends on where you live. So in Alberta, it's usually early June before it's consistently warm enough on pastures for the parasites to come out of the eggs and become the larva. And generally by mid-September, it's cold enough that there's no longer infective larvae. So what I tell my clients is the middle of July to middle of August is when you should do your egg counts. If they're high at that point, you've got time to deal with the problem before you go into winter. If they're low at that point, the grazing season will be over before they'll get a high enough load for it to be a problem. So there's your optimal time. When and how you would use dewormers will depend on what the results of those egg count tests are. Testing in the winter makes no sense. The parasites in most small ruminants hibernate in the wall of the rumen and they don't produce eggs. So even if they're there, you'll get a low count. So we don't do fecal tests at all in the wintertime.
And again, like you said, it's not complete elimination. It's managing and keeping those counts down into a reasonable level somewhere. So one more quick question here before we get ready to go. I assume that was right. I shouldn't assume you're the expert, but I think that's what you told me anyway. Fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. It's all about managing them. Yeah.
One more quick question here, and it's just a matter of, so how can we find vitamins A and D? So I would think that would be sort of, do you add vitamins A and D in a supplement? Do you just make sure that the feed has sufficient nutrition that they get them?
So I'm assuming the question is because the people want the injectable form of A and D, which it often is on back order. It's difficult to get. It got really difficult to get when the big vitamin plant in Germany had a big fire a few years ago, and they made it for the whole world. And so all the human stuff got priority over the veterinary stuff. My personal bias is injecting it is not an alternative to appropriate feed. So if you should be feeding an appropriate mineral in the winter that has A and D added to it, and you need to buy it and use it fresher and not carry it over through the summer. In the summer, A and D is fine. They're out grazing. They eat vitamin A in the grass. They get vitamin D from being out in the sunshine. It's in the winter that you need the extra A and D, and it should be added to the mineral or the supplement they're on. A and D injectable to me is just kind of a last resort in a crisis. It's not how they should do it all the time.
Okay. I'm going to let Aaron have one
How
follow-up.
do you find it when it's on back order? I don't know.
Well, like so many things, if it's on back order.
How you would find it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to let one more just pop in here, and that's Aaron's follow-up on his polio feeding rations, but high or mainly all silage. So if feeding a lot of silage, could that contribute to a cause for the polio?
It could if it's truly silage with a fairly high grain component. They maybe need to consider feeding if they're using a vitamin mineral supplement pellet. What they do with dairy cattle on very high grain rations is they actually feed them a buffered supplement, so it has sodium bicarbonate added to it, or calcium bicarbonate, and it just keeps the rumen pH more neutral. It gets quite acidic on a high grain ration, and so if they're seeing a lot of that, they might want to consider buffering it with bicarb.
Okay, thank you. You know what? Before we get all the way up to the top of the hour, which would be the longest session. So the last one that we did had the most interaction and has gone the longest. So maybe we did leave the best for last at the end of the day. And Dr. Tait, you've been amazing. That's awesome. If there was, you were going into this session, was there a takeaway, like anything in particular that you really wanted people to be able to get out of this session? And if so, what was it?
I think the biggest thing for me is that as this industry grows, and it is growing, and more producers get involved, I think try to develop that team approach as far as nutrition, veterinary care, management, get good advice, not necessarily just whatever's out there on things like Facebook groups, and put that to work right at the beginning, because building that team in the long run, I think, will be very helpful to you. And veterinarians are just a part of that team, and we really truly want to help producers succeed. It's not just about us controlling all the drugs.
Outstanding. That's a good takeaway. It's a wide ranging takeaway, but as you said, it's a wider sphere. It's not little individual things. It's all big picture. So thank you for helping paint that picture for us. We really appreciate it. And obviously with the comments and the questions come through, that our audience has enjoyed it as well. Dr. Lynn Tait, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And speaking of pleasure, this has been so much fun over the last many weeks to bring you these Raised with Care Stewardship Sessions through live stream, and then having them available to you in an archive form afterward. To all of you who have taken part in these and hopefully enjoyed them, thank you so much for your involvement. And you can also still go back and look at all of our past episodes. You can run through this one again or any of the previous ones simply by going to the raisedwithcare.ca website and following the links. We saw a comment here a little while ago. Can we do this again? I don't know. We'll check with the ABVMA and find out whether we'll do this again in the coming year. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed them. I have really enjoyed hosting them on behalf of our production team from EV Plus Agency and the Alberta Veterinary Medical Association. Thank you so much for watching. We appreciate it. I'm Daryl McIntyre. Cheers.